Hello everyone, my name is Delicacy, and this is Video Delicacies, where we seek to taste the greatest flavors that old games have to offer. I just played Spyro, Year of the Dragon, which was developed by Insomniac Games, produced by Universal Interactive Studios, and published by Sony Computer Entertainment America. It was released for the Sony PlayStation in the Year of the Dragon 2000 and had a remastered version released for various platforms in 2018. Year of the Dragon is the third game in the Spyro series, following Spyro the Dragon and Spyro 2: Ripto's Rage, both of which I've talked about in previous videos. Until about 8 months ago, I had never played any of these games, but I did know slightly more about Year of the Dragon going in than I did the others. Specifically, I knew that this game included skateboarding and a playable penguin character. Incidentally, if I had to describe how this game differed from the first two, it would be hard to come up with a more concise articulation than, this is the kind of game that includes skateboarding and a playable penguin character. But anyway, let's start from the beginning. Spyro Year of the Dragon opened with a cutscene set in the world of dragons. A mysterious hooded figure arose from the ground and ordered a group of her subordinates, the rhinoceros-like Rhinox, to steal the dragon's eggs. While retreating to her tunnel, she accidentally awoke Hunter the cheetah, who evidently followed his friend Spyro here after the events of the previous game. Spyro and Hunter gave chase, but she evaded them and was able to return with the stolen eggs to her mentor, a character known only as the Sorceress. Unbeknownst to her, the burglar was trailed by Zoe the fairy, who then reported the eggs' location back to Spyro. That location was known as the Forgotten Worlds, and it was up to Spyro, Hunter, and Zoe to go there, since the holes left behind by the Rhinox were too small for the dragon adults. Oh, and Sparks goes too, but he's not in the cutscene. The first homeworld of Year of the Dragon was called Sunrise Spring, cleverly completing the seasonal convention of the previous game, while also kicking off a time of day naming scheme for this game's worlds. The controls of Year of the Dragon are the same as the previous games, with the notable exception that I could now press L1 or R1 to center the camera behind Spyro. It was a small addition, but a great one. It came with a quirk though. Centering the camera while walking would cause Spyro to brake momentarily. The reason for this was that those buttons had another new function. By holding L1 or R1, I could rotate Spyro without moving him. I never used this. All of the abilities that Spyro learned during the events of Ripto's Rage were available from the start this time, including the head bash. Also returning was the hover ability, where I could press triangle at the end of a glide to gain a little bit of height. I had found that to be awkward when I started Ripto's Rage, but by this point I had become an expert at it. The main collectible item in Year of the Dragon was the egg. Upon reaching one, it would hatch into a new dragon. It's the miracle of life. There were a total of 150 eggs in the game, and in my playthrough I found 123 of those. Since there were so many, I will not be going over each of them individually. When I approached the portal to the first stage, the hooded character from the opening rode in on the back of a rainbow. Her name was Bianca, and she was very talkative.
So, you're the one in charge of rescuing the eggs, huh? How sad. Look here, Dragon. If you know what's good for you, you'll turn around and crawl back up that hole you came through. Those eggs belong to us now, and I've hidden them in places you'll never find in 1,000 years. Besides, even if you could find an egg, our expertly trained armies will dispose of you and take it back. Do I make myself clear? If I find you here again, I am going to be very angry. And you won't like me when I'm angry.
That stage was an ancient Rome-themed one called Sunny Villa. The first thing that struck me about Year of the Dragon was that it was very similar to Ripto's Rage. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised. This trilogy came out back to back to back, with only 11 months separating the second and third games. That's an extremely short development time, but it's not like they could have delayed this game. After all, if they wanted to call it Year of the Dragon, they only had until January 23rd, 2001. And that's assuming they trusted the audience to know about Chinese New Year. Far more importantly though, this game came out 2 weeks before the North American launch of the PlayStation 2, and I can't imagine that being a coincidence. Given what the working conditions must have been like to meet that deadline, I can't really fault this game for reusing things like text boxes. Upon reaching the end of the stage, I received the egg of a dragon named for the Colonel. I appreciated that Year of the Dragon continued its predecessor's commitment to naming every NPC, no matter how minor. The second stage I went to is called Cloud Spires. You can always count on the Spyro games to have pretty castles in them, and this was one of those. The character Moneybags was back, though this game was much meaner toward him. He was actively portrayed as collaborating with the antagonist for profit, and I was frequently given the option to be rude to him. It was a good reminder of how capitalists should be treated. Stages in Year of the Dragon had sub-areas, accessed through starry portals found off of the main path. There were two in this stage. One had me using a Superfly power-up to defeat the evil spirits possessing 6 bell towers. The other had me using Fire Breath to spurn sun seeds into a cauldron where they became a new sun. Another level here was a tropical volcano one called Molten Crater. Given that this was a game about searching for stolen eggs, it should come as no surprise that the loathsome egg thieves were back. A sub-area had me chasing one down on a racetrack. Once I had caught them, a second, faster thief appeared, and to allow me to catch up to that one, the ground became a supercharged track. I thought it was clever to combine these two returning elements in order to create a new type of challenge. This was probably the most fun I had chasing egg thieves in any of these games. One of the stages in the second world featured a more difficult execution of this concept, and that version was even more fun. While I find the inclusion of the thieves in these games questionable, it's no mystery to me why they kept bringing back the supercharge. It felt really satisfying to run around at high speed like that once I had learned the course's layout. Sunrise Spring also had a water level, which was tongue-twisteringly titled Seashell Shore. Here I encountered the most frustrating egg so far in what Sandy the Seal called the ultra-high-speed superfluidity tunnel. While in the ultra-high-speed superfluidity tunnel, Spyro's forward movement was automatic as he was swept by the rushing water. My goal was to touch every Rhinoc along the course while avoiding every mine. Parts of this game felt like they were designed with variety prioritized over fun, and this was among the worst offenders. This concept returned in a World 4 stage. That time, however, there were no enemies I needed to hit, only obstacles to be avoided. I think that swapping these two so that the simpler one came first might have alleviated some of my aggravation. Back in the Sunrise Spring homeworld, Moneybags was incarcerating a kangaroo named Sheila. In exchange for a 300 gem bribe, he released her into Spyro's custody. Sheila was the first of 4 characters who the manual referred to as playable critters. While much of Year of the Dragon felt like a continuation of Ripto's Rage, these alternate playable characters went a long way toward giving this game its own identity. Whenever one of these critters was unlocked, they would come with a tutorial level demonstrating how they differed from Spyro. The first of these was called Sheila's Alp. While I was in control of her, Sheila was followed by Sparks, perhaps implying that he was the game's true protagonist. Sheila bounced when she walked, which made her movement feel a little imprecise, but I think this was more of an animation issue than a control one. Her jump was higher than Spyro's, and she could do a second one while in the air. I'd be tempted to call this maneuver a double jump, but the game used that term to describe another of her abilities. Upon landing, my controller would briefly vibrate. If I pressed X during that window, that jump would go higher than the first one. This higher jump could be chained indefinitely as long as I never missed the timing. In addition to their tutorial levels, the playable critters returned in sub-areas which were scattered throughout the game. The most difficult Sheila segment was in a World 2 stage. There were 2 siblings, Busone and Basho, who each needed to carry an explosive from one point to another, but they were clumsy and so I needed to clear obstacles out of their way. Sheila had a kick that could be used to destroy rocks, and a stomp which could smash mushrooms. There were a lot of red herrings, so I had to pay attention to which routes the two took to know which obstacles I needed to destroy. To complicate things, the destroyed obstacles would respawn after a short while, so I couldn't get too far ahead. Another notable Sheila area was in World 4, and I was astounded by this one. They made an entire 2D side-scrolling game type, and then used it exactly once for this single Sheila section. It was such a wild thing to encounter that late in the video game. Year of the Dragon certainly had no shortage of ideas. The Sorceress was angry that Bianca had only tried to scare Spyro off, and so she ordered her directly to kill him. Bianca used magic to transform one of the Rhinocs into a monster capable of carrying out the deed. Though, violence not being in her nature, it took a couple of tries to get the spell right. At the end of each stage, a character I helped would exit through the end portal. These characters congregated in the homeworld, where they readied a vehicle that would take Spyro to the next world. The first of these vehicles was the familiar balloon. En route to its destination, the balloon made a stop at a boss arena. Here, Spyro and Sheila faced off against Bianca's monster Buzz. As Spyro, I needed to bully the bully into the lava. Then, Sheila would automatically perform a stomp attack, damaging them. They had a spin attack that made a saw sound effect, hence the name Buzz, and they could also emit flames. There was no way to regenerate health during this fight, which was scary, but I was able to win on my second try. One aspect of this trilogy that I haven't talked about much is the voice acting. While Spyro doesn't speak during gameplay, all three of these games feature a ton of voiceover in dialogue and cutscenes. In the first Spyro the Dragon, Spyro's voice was provided by Carlos Alazraqui, who you might know as Rocco from Rocco's Modern Life. However, he was recast, and in Ripto's Rage, Year of the Dragon, and 2002's Enter the Dragonfly, he was voiced by Tom Kenny, the actor for Heifer from Rocco's Modern Life. In 1999, the same year he began voicing Spyro, Kenny embarked on his most famous role, SpongeBob SquarePants. Video game voice acting was a new field at the time, so it makes sense that they looked to animation when casting these games. Following Sunrise Spring, the second world of Year of the Dragon was Midday Gardens. Bianca showed up at the start of the world to once again try to intimidate Spyro into giving up his quest. She said that she was warning him for his own good, and based on the earlier cutscene, I think she believed that. The first stage that I entered in this world was an alpine one called Icy Peak. One of the eggs here required me to guard a figure skater whose performance was threatened by a group of hockey players. Their pattern was the same every time, so it mostly came down to memorization. After I got the egg, there was dialogue mentioning that the Olympics exist in Spyro's world. Sadly, it would be 8 more years before he'd be able to see Mario and Sonic compete. Next up was Enchanted Towers, which was another pretty castle stage. This was one of the locations which featured the skateboarding minigame. Hunter was in each of these places, wearing what I guess I would describe as jinkos, with like a wide belt. Not his best look. While skateboarding, I could press X to jump. Pressing X while going off of a ramp would allow me to get more air, and pressing X while going off of the top of a half-pipe would allow me to go back down it, rather than going over. Holding triangle while in the air would allow me to do tricks using directional inputs. If I lost my board, either by failing a trick or by bonking, I would need to find another. The goal here was to score more points than Hunter within a 2-minute time limit. This was extremely challenging for me. Even after Hunter's tutorial, I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to be doing. Perhaps it's a good time to mention that another classic video game franchise that I've never played is Tony Hawk's. The first of that series, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, came out about a year before this game did, so I have to imagine that it was the inspiration for this minigame. There was a trick called Triple Towers that was an easy 1000 points just for doing some platforming. I liked that because it didn't require me to engage much with the actual skating mechanics. Unfortunately, I couldn't just do triple towers repeatedly, because each time I did a trick, that trick's point value would be halved. The best payout seemed to be for a mid-air trick called the Nasty Nork, which I could get by doing 3 flips and 1 roll while going off the biggest ramp. On my 5th attempt, I finally got enough points in one run to impress Hunter. While the Enchanted Towers version was the one that seemed the most like an actual skating game, this minigame did make 2 other appearances. There was one in World 1 where I needed to catch 15 lizards around a skate park, and wiping out would require me to completely start over. The final one was in World 3, where I had to race against a gang of Rhinox skaters. Doing tricks during the race would fill a turbo meter, which I could expend for a speed boost by holding square. I found this to be impossibly difficult. The best I was able to get was 4th place. This was one of the few eggs that I gave up on. Back in World 2, another stage was called Spooky Swamp. Inexplicably, all of the NPCs in this one spoke in haiku. And not just the locals, but Moneybags and Sheila also. This level was notable for having its own boss, a wizard named Sleepyhead. They would alternate between throwing 3 gator enemies and throwing a bomb. I had to hit these bombs with a charge attack to send them back at the wizard. After that, I went to Bamboo Terrace. One interesting thing here was that there was an egg thief whose circuit spanned the entirety of the stage. Stages in this game were typically designed in a circular pattern. The end would be close to the start, often just above it or just behind a locked door. Once the main goal for the level was completed, a shortcut would join the circle together. The playable critter for World 2 was the penguin, Sergeant James Byrd. He had kind of a lot going on conceptually, being both a military officer guy and also a 007 parody. For freeing him from moneybags, I was able to enter the portal to Sergeant Byrd's base. The goal there was to rescue a squad of adorable hummingbird soldiers, who the sergeant was training to go to war against the Sorceress. By pressing X, Byrd could flutter in the air indefinitely in a Kirby-like manner. He had a projectile attack that I could fire with the circle button, and I could aim using triangle while on the ground. He was able to pick up certain objects by landing on them. These could then be dropped by pressing square, and pressing triangle while in the air would switch to a downward camera for aiming. I located 4 of the 5 squad members fairly quickly, but I had to comb over the stage multiple times before I found the last one. There was a metal container early on, and to open it, I would need to carry back a bomb from later in the stage. That wasn't hard to figure out, but these containers normally only hold gems, so I left it alone for a while. Once I was out of ideas, I did finally blow it up. Naturally, the floor beneath it was destructible, leading to the final Byrd, who gave me the egg. With that in hand, I returned to World 1, where I espied a Sergeant Byrd portal earlier. The task here required me to pick up the heads of tikis scattered throughout a hazardous cave and return them to their bodies in the central chamber. After completing that, I checked the atlas, which I could do by pressing the select button. The atlas would sometimes list the names of eggs that I hadn't found yet, giving me a hint as to their location. In this case, there was one simply called Sergeant Byrd Blows Up a Wall, so I did just that and found the egg. There was later a Byrd portal in World 3 where he had a date with a fairy named Isabel. However, their date spot was occupied by some exceedingly cute cat witches. There were 3 rounds of battle against them, with the third one removing the floor, requiring me to continue hovering the whole fight. The residents of the Midday Gardens worlds crewed a whirligig to carry Spyro to the next world, but first, there was a battle against a boss named Spike. While bosses in this game are always fought in plain circular arenas, I want to point out that they have very nice looking backgrounds. I particularly liked this one with its twisted, abstract terrain and big purple moon. There were 3 phases to the fight, and in each one, Sergeant Byrd provided Spyro with a different type of ammunition to use against Spike. In the first phase, this ammo was balls, which needed to be used like the bombs from the wizard mini-boss. In the second phase, there were red sparkles, which allowed Spyro's fire to hurt the boss once. And in the third phase, there were blue sparkles, which Spyro could shoot out. These 3 different weapons were not explained at all, nor were they seen anywhere else in the game with these exact appearances, so it was kind of a confusing fight. I was ultimately able to prevail, but this is where I first game overed. As was typical of this series, there was no music on the game over screen. Year of the Dragon continued the tradition of including a playable demo for a Crash Bandicoot game. In this case, it was the minigame collection Crash Bash. The first minigame that I tried was called Pogo Painter. It was fun, but very chaotic. The goal was to color tiles by crossing them, and to then convert those colored tiles to score by touching crates. The CPUs didn't place a high enough priority on getting crates, making it very easy to block them from scoring, but I bet this game would be a great one to play with other humans. I found the pogo conceit to be a funny way of explaining why the characters only move one tile at a time. I also sampled a minigame called Polar Panic, though I was less impressed by this one. It was a pretty straightforward knock the other players out of the ring game. I wish that it had a higher camera angle, but that's my only real feeling about it. There was a place for a third minigame in the demo, but it wasn't unlocked even after I won a first to 3 of each of the others, so I moved on. World 3 was named Evening Lake. Bianca appeared before Spyro, as she had in the 2 previous worlds, pleading with him to get out while he still could. This time, she even promised to personally look after the dragon eggs. I love her. She feels the most like an actual character out of anyone in these 3 games. The first stage that I went to was called Frozen Altars, where Spyro was approached by a fairy named Gabrielle. Hey, wait a second. That was the name of one of the hummingbird soldiers from Sergeant Byrd's stage. But wait, that's not the only instance of this happening. One of the eggs hatched into a dragon named James, which was Sergeant Byrd's forename. There were also 2 characters named Amy, both spelled with an I. There were 2 Eloises too, though at least the spellings were different that time. This probably isn't a detail that would bother most players, but it stood out to me as someone who cares a lot about names. Oh yeah, Frozen Altars. It uses the Super Freeze power-up. Cool to see that back. There was also a stage in World 3 called Fireworks Factory. The episode of The Simpsons titled The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie Show aired in 1997, 3.5 years before this game came out, so the title is almost certainly a reference. Greta and Hondel from Ripto's Rage were back, though their activities were less politically charged this time. They were on a mission to recover rocket plans that were stolen by the Sorceress. They didn't need much help from Spyro, as Greta did most of the work herself in an homage to The Matrix. The stage was a real time capsule of late 90s pop culture. In terms of gameplay though, the most remarkable segment here was one in which I needed to use a combination power-up to defeat 2 flying serpents. I really liked the way that they were rendered in separate segments. It felt like a throwback to games of an earlier era. Next up was Lost Fleet, a stage about looking for treasure amongst shipwrecks. It was, for me, the least memorable stage of the world. It was followed by a cute cutscene though, in which Bianca, who had kidnapped Hunter, let her hood down, revealing that she was a rabbit, and that she had been wearing a cute dress this whole time. And after that was my favorite level in the game, Charmed Ridge. Princess Amy of the Fairies had evidently been abducted by Prince Azrael of the Cats, and it was up to Spyro to rescue her. Prior to playing them, I had always assumed that the Spyro games were fairy tale themed. I knew that they were about a dragon, so I thought that there would be knights and princesses and unicorns and stuff. There's a bit of that here and there, but Charmed Ridge is the first stage of any of these games that really aligned with my imagined version of Spyro. That's not the only reason I loved it though. It brought back the cool beanstalk puzzle from Spyro 2 with a new twist. Previously, there was only one type of seed, and the shape of the plants into which it grew was based on where it was planted, but here that was reversed. The location didn't matter, but different seeds became different plants. It was a great evolution of the concept. Naturally, the twist at the end of the stage was that Amy and Azrael were in fact a happy couple and that no rescuing was necessary. This would have been a good bit, except it didn't land for me because they had basically already done this joke earlier in the game. There was a Sheila section where a character asked her to rescue his girlfriend, but upon rescuing her, the so-called girlfriend revealed that she was actually being crept on. Each world had one last stage that was only accessible after beating that world's boss, and in these stages, I played as Sparks. Unfortunately, I didn't enjoy them much. These stages seemed like an afterthought. They weren't integrated into the rest of the game like the playable critters were. They were entered through dialogue with Zoe rather than through a portal, and instead of having their own music, they simply played the track from the title screen. Sparks was controlled from an overhead view. Circle shot a projectile, and holding L1 or R1 allowed him to move without changing his facing. Butterflies restored his health, and could also grant power-ups. Sparks had a health bar in this mode, which baffled me because the entire reason he exists is so that Spyro doesn't need a health bar. The graphic wasn't even implemented correctly, it never reached 0. These stages were actually pretty important because they came with permanent upgrades. For example, completing the third one increased Sparks' HP by 1, which was huge. Tragically, it didn't confer a new color to him, it just meant that he was gold for twice as long. World 3's critter was a Yeti named Bentley. He had a cute younger sibling named Bartholomew, who was a recurring character in his stages. He also had extremely distinct theme music. Bentley had the worst movement speed and jump height of any of the playable characters. If I pressed circle, I could swing his club, which was very cleverly made out of ice so as to not obstruct the player's view. By pressing square, I could spin it to deflect projectiles. Bentley could also push things by walking into them. I really liked Bentley's outpost, his tutorial level, but I found him sadly underutilized otherwise. The 2 other stages that used his normal moveset were basically just about smashing things, no deflecting or pushing needed. And the other section where I was allowed to play as him was in a boxing match. It was disappointing to be offered the chance to play as a character I enjoyed, only for it to turn out to be a generic minigame. World 3 ended with my favorite cutscene in the game.
Enough! I'm going to create a monster to end all monsters! And I'm going to send it out to destroy all the dragons, even the little hatchlings! Yes, yes! It will smash them and crush them and grind them and tear them! Oh, yes! Smear them and smoosh them and crack them and crease them! But, won't that kill them?
A rocket then carried me to the boss, Scorch. They could summon several different types of enemies, and could also attack by throwing a barrage of bombs which I would need to avoid by watching shadows. Bentley helped Spyro out by providing rockets. I could fire these at Scorch, who was vulnerable while moving from place to place. This was the easiest of the 4 main bosses for me, and so I was quickly on to the final world. While this was the last of the original Spyro trilogy, the legacy of these games didn't end here. Insomniac Games went on to create the Ratchet & Clank series, and the Spyro character lived on through games worked on by many other developers. Digital Eclipse made 3 Spyro games on the Game Boy Advance. The next Spyro game on home consoles was Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, developed by Equinox Digital Entertainment. 2 more GBA games, Crash Bandicoot Purple and Spyro Orange, were developed by Vicarious Visions. I remember seeing these 2 in game stores at the time and being really mystified by them. 2 PlayStation mascots crossing over on a Nintendo platform was just so unexpected. That same year was the next console game, Spyro A Hero's Tale, which was developed by Eurocom. It was followed by 3 Nintendo DS games developed by Amaze Entertainment. 2 of those had console counterparts by Chrome Studios. And then one final game was developed by Étrange Libellule for consoles and Tantalus for DS. Beginning in 2011, Spyro was featured in the Skylanders series of Toys to Life games, which was created by Toys for Bob, which later went on to develop the Spyro Reignited trilogy. I never heard much about Spyro after the PS1, so I didn't realize until now just how messy this series got. This'll likely be my last video covering a Spyro game, but I'd be interested in hearing which of the others you think I might like. Night had finally come. The last world was called Midnight Mountain. There was a door leading to the Sorceress's lair, which Bianca explained would open once I had gathered enough eggs, though she didn't give a specific number. My guess is that the requirement was 100, but I ended up having a lot more than that. The first stage was called Crystal Islands, and it was filled with gnomes, who were skilled in the art of stage magic, but they weren't the best at spelling. It was a cool stage visually, with lots of big crystals and floating landmasses. A portal behind the end led to a slide. Most of the minigames in Year of the Dragon didn't have their own music, they instead continued to play the stage theme regardless of how fitting it was. Maybe that only stood out to me here because Super Mario 64's slide music was so iconic. After that was the ancient Egypt-themed Haunted Tomb. This stage was mostly about pressing switches to open doors, which would close again on a timer. There was also a running bit of NPCs posing riddles. Then there was the similarly themed Desert Ruins level. A mouse wanted help finding his girlfriend Tara, who was revealed at the end of the stage to be a Lara Croft parody. I thought that this was corny, but I'll take that over a lot of the humor in these games. My favorite thing here was these pipe monster enemies who were able to heat metal surfaces. This led to some fun situations where I needed to time my jumps so that I would land when the floor was safe. At one point, I needed to climb a wall with one of these monsters atop it. It could only heat 1/3 of the wall at a time, but it could move to whichever section I was on. Tricky. Next was a Western-themed level called Dino Mines, where Spyro stumbled upon a sheriff who had been locked in his own cell by a bunch of dinosaur outlaws. At the end of the stage, there was a breakable wall that I charged through to free the egg that was trapped inside. And I guess the cop too. There's one type of level that I haven't talked about yet, and that's the speedways. There was one of these in each of the 4 worlds, and they each had 2 modes. The first of those, Time Attack, was essentially the same as the flight stages from the 2 previous games. They were a bit easier this time around, because they gave me the full time limit up front rather than having me hunt down extensions within the course. The second mode was a race where I was asked to fly 3 laps through a series of rings. I found these to be really slow and boring, so I skipped any that I didn't get on my first try. There was a 3rd egg in each of these stages that required me to first find where Hunter was hiding and then play a minigame as him. The minigame was different each time, but none of them were particularly exciting. The final recruitable critter was a space monkey named Agent 9. I'm unclear what his relationship was to Agent 0 from the previous game. Agent 9's movement and jump were poor, but not to the same extreme as Bentley's. His main asset was his gunplay. While aiming, I could press L1 and R1 to zoom in and out, and while not aiming, I could use those very same buttons to strafe. I could hold square to aim bombs, in a manner similar to Custom Robo, though I would first need to acquire said bombs from a vending machine, which was only found in his tutorial level, Agent 9's lab. This character was even worse utilized than Bentley. One of his playable segments was a rail shooter minigame, and another was a series of overhead shooting segments that felt like a worse version of Sparks' levels. Anyway, I've now covered every stage in the game except for the final boss, but by now you should know that there's still one thing we need to talk about first. Spyro Year of the Dragon is the first game that I've played for this series which was not released in Japan, so we've only got 2 boxes to talk about. First is the North American one. You may have heard me say before that I'm generally not a fan of glowing outlines and motion blurs, and this cover is guilty of both. The real crime though is the logo. Do you think I don't know the Mortal Kombat insignia when I see it? As far as nice things to say about this box, I do like all of the playable critters being featured and how the differences in their sizes are emphasized. Now, let's move on to the PAL box. The thing that jumped out to me instantly was the total lack of gender diversity. Well, Sheila's probably on the back, right? Nope, but they did find space for a second render of Agent 9 in the exact same pose. I think that putting Spyro on a skateboard was a fun idea, though I don't care at all for Bentley staring directly at the camera. It's very clear that this cover is a composite of several images, unlike the NA version where the characters were all deliberately posed with one another. I don't love either box, but the North American one is at least the more professional looking of the two. The final battle was against the Sorceress herself. There were balloons floating above the arena, and Agent 9 ran around the perimeter shooting them down. Hanging from the balloons were sheep for healing, as well as various armaments. The first of these were stationary cannons. The second phase replaced the cannons with tanks. Then in the third phase, the tanks became flying saucers, which were the most difficult to control of the three. It's funny that the game was trying to make me feel like I was getting stronger as the fight went on, but it probably would have been easier if it just gave me the starting cannons the whole time. The constant supply of sheep during the fight meant that my health was never under much pressure, and so I won this one on my first try. The ending scenes featured Spyro going around to various characters and asking if they'd seen Hunter. These characters included the playable critters, as well as Alora the Fawn from Ripto's Rage. He eventually found that Hunter and Bianca had snuck off to enjoy a romantic evening together, with Sergeant Byrd providing fireworks. It was a sweet ending. I like these two, but Spyro opposed their relationship for childish reasons. Completing Spyro Year of the Dragon took me 12 hours and 57 minutes. There was a portal bricked closed in the last world which could only be opened by collecting every egg and gem in the game. While I think I was more thorough about getting gems in this game than I was in the previous two, I didn't have anywhere close to all of them, and so I was unable to access whatever secrets resided beyond. My final completion percentage was 82%. Playing these Spyro games had been my first real dive into PlayStation 1 platformers. However, I do have experience playing Nintendo 64 platformers from this era, so allow me to sum up my feelings about the Spyro trilogy by way of analogy. Spyro the Dragon was a lot like Super Mario 64. It was a fairly simple game, but it had excellent movement, and levels which were designed around showcasing that movement. To me, it felt like Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage was to Spyro the Dragon what Banjo-Kazooie was to Mario 64. It greatly increased the variety and quantity of content, and added unlockable abilities. However, the core platforming gameplay was de-emphasized as level design now focused on getting the player from minigame to minigame. To complete the analogy, Spyro Year of the Dragon reminded me of Donkey Kong 64. It placed an even greater emphasis on diversity of content, adding additional playable characters, even more minigames, and upping the number of collectibles drastically. It was a fun game to play for a while, but the further I got into it, the more the game asked me to do tasks that were not really enjoyable or interesting. It had strayed away from what I looked for in a 3D platformer. While this was my least favorite of the trilogy, there were many things that I thought it did well. I liked that I had better control of the camera than before. I liked how the collectibles were named as a hint of where to find them. It's my opinion that, on average, the music got a little better in each of these games. And I think the character writing got a lot better. Ultimately, I liked all of these games. They have their flaws for sure, but it's undeniably fun to jump around as a cute cartoon dragon. Thank you all for joining me on my journey through the Spyro trilogy. I had a great time playing these games, and I hope that you had an equally good time watching these videos. If you did, I would love it if you left me a like or a comment. And if you've enjoyed several of my videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon to help me make more of them in the future. I may have finished this trilogy, but there is still so many games out there for me to play. To those of you listed here who have already signed up, thank you so much for your support. We've now arrived at the part of the video where I must rank the game that I've just played against all of the ones before it. Year of the Dragon wasn't a bad game. If it had been allowed enough development time to live up to its ambitions, I might have liked it even more than I did the first two Spyros. But as it stands, it's going near the bottom of the rankings, just below Star Fox 64 and above Shepherd's Crossing. For the next episode of Video Delicacies, I'll be playing a Konami game for the first time in the series. And it's not a Yu-Gi-Oh!, a Castlevania, a Silent Hill, or a Metal Gear. I hope you'll join me once again for that one.